old horse was 3 days from the slaughterhouse when Amos Rock made the worst financial decision of his life. $50, his last $50, for a bag of bones that couldn't even stand straight. The auctioneer laughed. The crowd whispered, but Amos saw something in those ancient eyes, something that remembered when the West was still wild. He didn't know he'd just bought a ghost, a guardian, a keeper of secrets that powerful men had killed to bury. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The morning Amos Rock turned 73, he woke up to silence so complete it felt like dying. No cattle lowing in the east pasture he'd sold the last of them 4 months back. No ranch hands calling to each other over morning coffee. There hadn't been hands in 2 years. Just the wind coming down off the Rockies, threading through the gaps in his barn walls, singing that lonesome song that empty places know by heart. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, staring out at 200 acres of Colorado grassland that used to mean something. The Clearwater Springs Ranch. His grandfather had built the original homestead in 1889, back when this valley still ran thick with promise. 3 generations of Rocks had worked this land, loved this land, bled into this dirt until it knew their names. Now it was just Amos and the ghosts. "You're being dramatic," he muttered to himself, the words falling flat in the empty kitchen. Place isn't dead, just resting. But he knew better. The bank letters were getting shorter, more insistent. The roof over the northern barn had collapsed last winter, and he'd just covered the hole with a tarp weighed down with stones. The fence line along County Road 7 sagged like an old man's spine. Everything was breaking down, wearing out, giving up, just like him. Amos drained his coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. He'd been reusing the same grounds for 3 days. Pride was a funny thing. It kept you from asking for help. Even when you were drowning, made you stretch $1 until it screamed, convinced you that admitting defeat was worse than starving quiet. He pulled on his boots. The left one had a hole near the toe he'd been meaning to patch, and headed outside. The September air bit cold, promising an early winter. His breath came out in clouds that dissolved into nothing like everything else around here. The truck coughed to life on the 3rd try. A 1987 Ford that ran on hope and habit, more rust than steel at this point. Amos had told himself he was just going into town for supplies. Some flour, maybe coffee that hadn't been brewed into oblivion, but he knew the truth. It was Saturday, 2nd Saturday of the month, auction day. Clearwater Springs wasn't much of a town anymore, hadn't been since the interstate bypass went in back in '94, pulling the lifeblood right out of Main Street. 3 blocks of false front buildings, half of them empty, the rest hanging on through sheer, stubborn habit. Miller's General Store, the Cattleman's Bank, Rosie's Diner, where the coffee was terrible, but at least it was hot, and at the far end of town where the asphalt gave way to dirt, the livestock auction yard. Amos could hear it before he saw it, the bawling of cattle, the sharp crack of the auctioneer's voice amplified through tinny speakers, the low rumble of men's laughter. He parked his truck in the shade of a dying cottonwood and sat for a moment, gathering himself. He hated coming here, hated seeing his neighbor's eyes skip over him like he was already gone, just another ghost haunting the edges of a dying way of life. But it was the only place left where he still felt connected to something, even if that something was fading fast. Amos Rockwell, I'll be damned. Amos turned to find Cal Pritchard, ambling over belly, preceding him like a ship's prow. Cal ran the feed store, or what was left of it, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Cal," Amos nodded, keeping his voice neutral. "Haven't seen you around much. Thought maybe you'd finally packed it in, headed down to Arizona like sensible folk." Cal's grin widened. "This heat's no good for old bones." It's 65 degrees, Cal. Well, still. Cal rocked back on his heels, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. You here to sell or buy, though I can't imagine what you'd be buying situation being what it is. There it was, the knife slipped in gentle the way small-town cruelty always came, wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile. Just looking, Amos said, moving past him toward the auction pens. Suit yourself, Cal called after him. Though looking don't pay bills, does it? Amos kept walking, jaw tight, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. His right hand brushed against something paper folded small. He pulled it out. 3 20s and 2 5s. $50. His grocery money for the next 2 weeks. His everything money, if he was being honest. The auction yard smelled like it always did, mud, manure, fear, and that particular animal panic that came from being penned and numbered and sold. Amos leaned against the fence, watching the proceedings with the detachment of someone who'd seen this show too many times. Young heifers went first, bidding brisk and competitive. Good breeding stock always fetched decent money. Then came the bulls, massive and mean, followed by horses working quarter horses, mostly a few paints animals with purpose and value. Amos was about to leave when he heard the auctioneer's voice change, dropping from the rapid-fire rhythm of commerce into something closer to mockery. All right, folks, now we got something special, real special. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lot 67, one gelding approximately 20 years old, give or take a decade. More laughter. Amos craned his neck to see. They led the horse into the ring, and Amos felt something in his chest constrict. The animal was a wreck, ribs showing through a dull brown coat, hip bones jutting like mountain peaks, head hanging so low his nose nearly touched the dirt. His hooves were overgrown and cracked, his mane a tangled mess of burrs and neglect. But it was his eyes that stopped Amos, cold, dark, deep, ancient eyes that held something that looked almost like dignity, even here, even now. Now I'll be straight with you, the auctioneer continued, voice heavy with sarcasm. This fine specimen has been donated to us by the estate of Harlan Mitchell, who passed last month. God rest him. Horse came with the property, nobody wants him, and he's scheduled for the slaughter truck Monday morning if nobody takes him off our hands. Just shoot him now, save the diesel, someone shouted. The crowd erupted in laughter. Amos felt his hands ball into fists. Probably the humane thing, the auctioneer agreed, but we're required to offer him up first. So what do you say, folks? Anyone feeling charitable? Do I hear $20? Silence. 15. Nothing. Come on now, $10. That's less than a case of beer. $10 for... He consulted his clipboard. For a horse named Dusty, apparently, though I think Rusty might be more accurate. The laughter rolled again, cruel and easy. The horse Dusty stood in the center of the ring, utterly still except for a slight tremor in his back legs. His eyes swept across the crowd, unseeing, already gone to some place beyond this humiliation. Then those eyes found Amos. It was impossible, rationally impossible, but Amos would swear until his dying day that the horse looked directly at him, not the blank stare of an animal, but the focused gaze of someone who recognized him, who knew him, who needed him. $5. The auctioneer's voice had lost its humor, become perfunctory. Nobody, all right then. Lot 67 is declined. We'll load him with $50. The words were out of Amos's mouth before his brain caught up with them. The crowd went silent, heads swiveling to find the voice. Amos stepped forward, hand already reaching for his wallet, heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape the catastrophic decision his mouth had just made. The auctioneer blinked. I'm sorry, did you say $50? Amos repeated louder now. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. That's my bid. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Cal Pritchard's voice cut through the silence, sharp with disbelief. Amos, you gone simple. That animal won't last the winter. $50, Amos said again, pulling out his bills, holding them up like a flag of surrender. Going once. The auctioneer recovered his professional smile, though confusion flickered beneath it. "Well, all right then, $50 for lot 67. Going once, going twice." He paused, scanning the crowd for any competing bids that would save him from this absurdity. None came. "Sold to Amos Rock." The gavel cracked down. Amos stood there, 320s and 25s clutched in his shaking hand, wondering what the hell he'd just done. "You know, you just bought a corpse, right?" The yard manager, a weathered man named Tom Hendricks, led Amos around back to the holding pens, shaking his head the whole way. "That horse is 20 if he's a day. Probably closer to 30. Nobody feeds an animal that old unless they're soft in the head or rich, and you ain't rich." "Appreciate the financial advice, Tom," Amos muttered. "Just trying to save you from yourself." Tom stopped in front of a small pen where Dusty stood alone apart from the other animals. "He's got papers, if you can believe it. Came in a box with the estate stuff. Registration, vaccination records, all ancient history, but they're there." He handed Amos a battered manila envelope. "Mitchell bought him at another auction 15 years back, apparently. Kept him out on that scrub property of his, barely fed him, barely looked at him, Mom. When Mitchell died, the nephew didn't want nothing to do with him." Amos opened the envelope. Inside was a registration certificate yellowed with age for a horse named Dusty's Last Stand, foaled in April 1998. That would make him 27 years old for a horse, but not impossibly so. But there was something else in the envelope. Another document, older, half deteriorated, a breeding record or lineage chart. The ink so faded Amos could barely make it out. He squinted at it, catching fragments. Bloodline documented to 1875. Descended from Cavalry mount. "What's this?" he asked. Tom glanced at it, shrugged. "Some kind of history thing. Mitchell was into that genealogy crap, trying to prove his family went back to the frontier days or whatever. Guess he thought the horse did too." He chuckled. "Like anybody cares." Amos folded the documents carefully, tucking them back in the envelope. When he looked up, Dusty was watching him again with those impossible eyes. "You got a trailer?" Tom asked. "No. Course you don't." "Well, I can't keep him here past closing. You'll have to walk him home, I guess." He unlocked the pen gate. "Good luck with that. He can barely stand." But when Amos stepped into the pen, Dusty's head came up. Slowly, painfully, the old horse straightened, joints popping audibly. He took one step toward Amos, then another, moving with a careful deliberation that spoke of deep pain and deeper will. Amos reached out, letting his hand hover near Dusty's muzzle. The horse sniffed once, breath warm against Amos's palm, then lowered his head in what could only be described as acceptance. "All right, old-timer," Amos said softly. "Let's get you home." The walk back to the ranch should have taken 40 minutes. It took 3 hours. Dusty moved like every step might be his last, favoring his left front leg, breathing hard through the effort. Amos kept the lead rope loose, letting the horse set the pace, ignoring the cars that slowed to stare as they passed the crazy old man and his dying horse walking down the county road like ghosts from another century. By the time they reached the ranch gates, the sun was dropping behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and shadow. Amos's feet ached, his back was screaming, and his stomach was eating itself. With hunger he couldn't afford to satisfy. But Dusty was home. He settled the horse in the barn's only remaining good stall, spreading what little hay he had left, filling the water bucket from the yard pump. Dusty drank deeply, then immediately ate 3 mouthfuls of hay before his legs began to shake again. "Easy," Amos murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. The coat was rough under his palm, the muscles beneath wasted to almost nothing. "Take it slow, you got time now." Did he, though? Amos looked at the horse, really looked, and felt the weight of what he'd done settle over him like a shroud. $50 he didn't have for an animal he couldn't feed, who probably wouldn't last the month anyway. "I'm an idiot," he said aloud. Dusty turned his head, fixing Amos with that strange, knowing gaze. Then deliberately the horse took 2 steps forward and lowered his head until his forehead rested against Amos's chest. It was such a human gesture, trust, gratitude, connection, that Amos felt something crack open inside him. When was the last time anything had needed him, really needed him? When was the last time he'd mattered to anyone or anything? He stood there in the gathering darkness, one hand on the old horse's neck, and let himself feel it. The loneliness he'd been outrunning for years, the fear that he'd outlived his purpose, the desperate, aching need to believe that mercy wasn't foolishness, that compassion counted for something in a world that seemed to have forgotten how. "We're gonna figure this out," he whispered. "You and me, somehow." Dusty sighed, a sound so deep and weary it could have been a century's worth of tired. That night, Amos ate beans cold from the can and stood at his kitchen window watching the barn. A half-moon hung low over the mountains, bright enough to paint everything in silver and shadow. He could just make out the dark shape of the barn, silent and still. Then movement caught his eye. Through the open barn door, backlit by moonlight, he saw Dusty. The horse had come out of his stall and was standing in the barn's main aisle, head raised, ears forward, staring out at something Amos couldn't see. The posture was all wrong for a broken-down animal barely able to walk. Dusty stood like a soldier at attention, like a sentry on watch, utterly still, except for the slight turn of his head as his gaze swept across the eastern horizon. Amos felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. "What are you looking at, old man?" he muttered. As if in answer, Dusty took 3 steps forward, smooth, purposeful steps, nothing like the painful shuffle from earlier, and pawed at the ground. Once, twice, 3 times. Not the random scraping of a restless animal, but deliberate, measured, methodical. Then the horse turned and walked back into his stall, the halting, painful gait, returning as if someone had flipped a switch. Amos stood at the window for a long time after that, beans forgotten, watching the empty barn doorway, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it. But he hadn't. And somewhere deep in his gut, in that place where instinct lived before logic killed it, Amos Rock knew his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. In the barn, Dusty settled into the hay with a soft grunt, closed his ancient eyes, and dreamed of battlefields and blood, of gold and glory, and promises written in smoke, of secrets that wouldn't stay buried forever. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of high-altitude September sun that burned off the chill but offered no real warmth. Amos woke to the sound of scraping metal on wood, rhythmic and insistent, coming from somewhere outside. He pulled on his jeans and stumbled to the window joints, protesting every movement. The barn door stood open, though he could have sworn he'd latched it last night. And there in the packed dirt of the yard was Dusty. The horse was digging, not the aimless pawing of a bored animal, but focused, deliberate excavation. His right front hoof struck the ground in a steady pattern, 3 scrapes forward, 2 to the side, 3 forward again. Dirt flew up in small clouds, catching the morning light. Amos pulled on his boots and headed outside, the cold air hitting his lungs like a slap. "Hey now, what are you doing out here?" Dusty's head came up sharply, ears swiveling toward Amos's voice. For a moment the horse stood frozen, caught in the act of something. Then just as suddenly as before, the alertness drained away. His head dropped, his weight shifted back to 3 legs, and he was once again just an old, broken animal standing in a dusty yard. But the hole remained. Amos walked over to examine it, maybe 8 inches deep, roughly circular, the edges surprisingly clean for something dug with hooves. At the bottom, something caught the light. Amos knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees, and brushed away loose dirt with his fingers. Metal. Tarnished and dirt-encrusted, but definitely metal. He worked it free from the earth, turning it over in his palm. A button. Military issue from the look of it, though, so corroded he could barely make out the design. He spat on it, rubbed it against his shirt sleeve, and squinted at the faint markings that emerged. U.S. His breath caught. Below that, even fainter, more letters. He couldn't make them out, but the eagle above them was unmistakable. Army. Cavalry, if he had to guess. That style of button went back more than a century. "Where the hell did this come from?" he muttered, looking up at Dusty. The horse watched him with those dark, knowing eyes, utterly still, except for the slight flare of his nostrils. Amos stood slowly, the button clutched in his fist, a cold understanding beginning to settle in his gut. The old registration papers mentioning cavalry bloodlines. Dusty's strange behavior last night, standing watch like a sentry. And now this, digging up a military artifact on Amos's property land that had been in his family for generations but had been open range before that, back when the cavalry still rode these valleys. "You trying to tell me something, old man?" Dusty snorted once, then turned and limped back toward the barn, each step painful and measured, as if the brief burst of purpose had cost him dearly. Amos stood in the growing light dirt on his hands and a Civil War-era button in his palm, wondering if he was losing his mind or if he'd stumbled into something far stranger than simple charity. He meant to spend the day fixing the fence line, but instead Amos found himself in town by noon, the button wrapped in a handkerchief in his jacket pocket. He told himself he was just being curious, that it was probably nothing, that he was just looking for distraction from the fact that he'd spent his last $50 on a horse that had now started excavating his yard. But his truck seemed to know where it was going, turning down Maple Street without him really deciding, pulling up in front of a neat white house with blue shutters and a garden that actually flourished despite the drought. Eleanor Whitman's house. Eleanor had taught history at Clearwater Springs High School for 42 years before retiring a decade back. She'd taught Amos's daughter back when Amos still had a daughter who came around. Now she spent her days volunteering at the County Historical Society and maintaining what she called institutional memory for a town that was rapidly forgetting it had a past. Amos climbed the porch steps and knocked. Through the window he could see bookshelves lining every wall, maps and photographs pinned up in careful arrangements, the organized chaos of someone who'd turned hobby into obsession. The door opened. Eleanor stood there in a cardigan despite the warmth, reading glasses hanging on a beaded chain around her neck, her white hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn since 1975. "Amos Rock," she said, surprised. "To what do I owe the pleasure? And don't tell me you're here for the Historical Society membership drive, because I know for a fact you think history is boring." "I never said boring," Amos protested. "I said impractical." "Ah, yes, much better." She stepped aside. "Come in. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Amos said, following her into the living room. Eleanor poured coffee without asking if he wanted any real coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and settled into her armchair with the air of someone preparing for a good story. "All right, what is it?" Amos pulled out the handkerchief, unwrapping it carefully. "Found this on my property this morning. Was hoping you could tell me what it is." Eleanor took the button, her expression shifting immediately from polite interest to focused intensity. She reached for her glasses, holding the artifact up to the light from her window. "Where exactly did you find this in my yard near the barn?" "Just lying on the surface." Amos hesitated. "Buried about 8 inches down." "And what were you digging for?" "I wasn't. My horse was." Eleanor's eyebrows rose, but she didn't comment on that particular absurdity. Instead, she stood and carried the button to her desk, pulling out a magnifying glass and a reference book with gilt lettering on the spine, Military Insignia of the American Frontier, 1860 to 1890. She flipped through pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, comparing the button to photographs and illustrations. Finally, she stopped. "7th Cavalry," she said quietly. "Enlisted man's coat button, issued between 1872 and 1876. She looked up at Amos, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what that means? That I've got old garbage buried in my yard? That you've got history buried in your yard?" Eleanor set the button down carefully as if it might explode. The 7th Cavalry was Custer's regiment. They were stationed at various forts throughout Colorado and Wyoming territories during that period. But Amos, most of them died at Little Bighorn in June of 1876. There were companies that weren't at the battle. Detached duty escort missions, patrol assignments. She pulled out another book, this one a journal bound in cracked leather. I've been researching this for years. There are gaps in the historical record units that were documented as leaving Fort Collins or Fort Laramie, but never arrived at their destinations. Men who simply vanished from the rolls. She opened the journal, revealing handwritten notes in faded ink. Names, dates, locations, all cross-referenced with question marks and underlining. One in particular has always bothered me. Eleanor continued, her finger tracing down a column of names. Captain Marcus Thornfield commanded a detail of 23 men tasked with transporting a government payroll from Denver to Fort Robinson in Nebraska. They left Denver on August 14, 1876. They never arrived. What happened to them? Nobody knows. The official report says they were likely ambushed by Cheyenne warriors, still hostile after Little Bighorn. But there were problems with that theory. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses came forward, and the Cheyenne chiefs all denied any knowledge of an attack. The whole thing was swept under the rug within 6 months. Eleanor looked at Amos over her glasses. The payroll they were carrying was worth $40,000. In 1876 gold. Do you know what that would be worth today? Amos shook his head, though his stomach was starting to tighten. Conservatively, 2, maybe 3 million, and that's just the metal value, not accounting for numismatic worth. She tapped the button. Where did you say your horse dug this up? Eleanor, you can't seriously think? I think that artifacts don't bury themselves. I think that your property sits right along what used to be a major freight route between Denver and the Wyoming territories. And I think that Captain Marcus Thornfield and his men disappeared somewhere in this valley carrying enough gold to make very powerful people very nervous. She stood and walked to her wall map, gesturing to the Colorado Territory as it had existed in 1876. The official route would have taken them northeast up through Cheyenne, but if they were trying to avoid something or someone, they might have cut west through these valleys. Her finger traced a line that ran directly through what would become Clearwater Springs. Through your ranch. Amos felt the room tilt slightly. That's crazy. Is it your horse digs up a cavalry button on your land from exactly the right period, from exactly the right unit? What are the odds of that being coincidence? Pretty good, considering horses don't understand history. Eleanor smiled, but there was no humor in it. Don't they? There are documented cases of animals returning to significant locations years, even decades later. Migration patterns, breeding grounds, battle sites. Some biologists believe it's genetic memory information passed down through generations in ways we don't fully understand. She walked back to her desk, pulling out another folder. After you called yesterday, I didn't call yesterday. Well, somebody who sounded remarkably like you called, asking if I'd be home this afternoon. She gave him a knowing look. I took the liberty of pulling my research on the Thornfield disappearance. There's more to this story, Amos. Much more. She spread papers across the coffee table, maps, newspaper clippings from 1876, handwritten correspondence, official military documents. 3 weeks after Thornfield vanished, a prospector named Samuel Cortez filed a claim for land in this valley. He struck it rich within a year, sold out for a fortune, and moved to San Francisco, where he became a major investor in the railroad. But here's the interesting part. Before that, Samuel Cortez had been a territorial official. Land office. He had access to survey maps, route information, and troop movements. You think he knew where the payroll was? I think he knew where it was going to be, and I think he made sure it never got there. Eleanor's voice dropped. There's a letter in the San Francisco archives written by Cortez's daughter in 1924, claiming her father confessed on his deathbed to being part of a conspiracy to rob the payroll. She said he and several other men ambushed the cavalry detail, killed everyone, and buried them somewhere in the mountains. But she was written off as a bitter old woman trying to damage her estranged family's reputation. No investigation was ever opened. Amos stared at the documents spread before him, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you found a button, because you have a horse that apparently knows where to dig, and because," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "because 2 days ago a woman came to the Historical Society asking about the Thornfield expedition. She said she was an archaeologist from the University of Colorado doing research on frontier military history. She wanted to see everything we had." "What did you tell her?" "I told her our archives were being reorganized and to come back next week. I don't know why, but something about her felt wrong. She asked very specific questions about land ownership in the valley, about who owned property along the old freight routes. She asked about you, Amos." The cold in Amos's stomach spread to his limbs. "Why would she ask about me?" "Because your family has owned that land longer than anyone else still living in the valley. Because if something's buried out there, it's on your property." Eleanor leaned forward. "And because later that same day I saw her having lunch at Rosie's diner with 2 men in suits. Not archaeologists, not academics, they looked like lawyers. Or worse, the kind of men who get called when something valuable needs to be protected or acquired." Amos set down his coffee cup before his shaking hands could spill it. "This is insane. You're talking about 150-year-old robbery that may or may not have happened gold, that's probably long gone, and some woman who might just be exactly what she says she is." "You're right," Eleanor said calmly. "It probably is insane. So why don't you go home, forget about the button, and everything will be fine." They looked at each other for a long moment. Eleanor's expression was perfectly neutral, but her eyes held a challenge. "Can I keep this?" Amos asked, gesturing to the research papers. Eleanor smiled. "I made you copies. I figured you'd want them." Amos drove home slowly, his mind spinning with dates and names and possibilities that seemed to belong to a different world than the one he lived in. Gold, murder, conspiracy. These were the materials of dime novels and late-night movies, not real life in a dying Colorado Valley in 2025. But the button in his pocket was real. The hole in his yard was real and dusty. He pulled into the ranch just as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The barn door stood open again, though he was certain he'd closed it that morning. "Dusty," he called, climbing out of the truck. No response. Amos walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel, a strange unease building in his chest. The horse was in his stall, but not resting. He stood rigid, head high, ears pinned back in a way that spoke of alarm. When Amos approached, Dusty's eyes rolled white, and he sidestepped, pressing himself against the far wall. "Easy, boy, it's just me." But Dusty wasn't looking at Amos. He was looking past him toward the barn entrance, nostrils flared and trembling. Amos turned slowly. A woman stood in the doorway, backlit by the dying sun so he couldn't make out her features. Slim professional clothes, a leather bag slung over one shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was bright and friendly, but it didn't match the way Dusty was acting. "Mr. Rock, I'm so sorry to startle you. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm an archaeologist with the University of Colorado." She stepped forward, extending her hand. "I was hoping we could talk about your property." Amos didn't take the hand. Behind him, Dusty released a low, rumbling snort that sounded almost like a growl. "How'd you find my place?" Amos asked. "Oh, small town. I asked at the diner." Her smile never wavered. "They said you'd recently acquired a horse. I'm actually doing research on frontier-era ranch sites, and I understand your family's land grant goes back to the 1880s. That makes it one of the oldest continuously owned properties in the valley. It's private property." Of course, I'm not asking to dig or anything invasive, just to do some preliminary surveying, maybe ground-penetrating radar in a few locations. We're trying to map out the old freight routes and—" She paused, seeming to notice Dusty for the first time. "And is that horse all right? He seems agitated." "He doesn't like strangers," Amos said flatly. "I can see that." Dr. Chen took a step back, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Look, I understand this is unusual, but there's potentially significant historical value on properties like yours. With your permission, we could conduct a proper archaeological survey. If we find anything, there might even be grant money available for preservation efforts. It could be quite lucrative for you." "I'm not interested in money." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or calculation. "Everyone's interested in money, Mr. Rock, especially these days. I understand the ranch has been struggling. The bank has filed preliminary foreclosure paperwork, hasn't it? The temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. You've been checking up on me, Dr. Chen. Just doing my due diligence. I like to know who I'm working with." She pulled a card from her bag, holding it out. "Think about it. My number's on there. The offer's genuine, and it could help you keep this place." Amos took the card without looking at it. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." She turned to leave, then paused. "That's a beautiful horse, by the way. Old Cavalry bloodline, if I'm not mistaken. They had such incredible endurance. Almost supernatural the way they could navigate terrain, remember routes. Like they carried maps in their very bones." She smiled again, and this time it didn't even pretend to reach her eyes. "You have a good evening, Mr. Rock. I'll be in touch." She walked out into the fading light, climbed into a rental car Amos hadn't noticed, parked by the road, and drove away. The moment her taillights disappeared, Dusty's entire demeanor changed. The tension drained from his body, his ears came forward, and he walked to the stall door, pressing his nose against Amos's shoulder. "You knew," Amos said quietly. "Didn't you?" "You knew she was wrong." Dusty's breath was warm against his neck, steady and calm, now that the danger had passed. Amos pulled out the business card, tilting it to catch the last light. "Dr. Sarah Chen," it read. "Archaeological Research, University of Colorado Boulder." He turned it over. On the back in small print, funded by the Cortez Foundation for Historical Preservation. Cortez, the same name Eleanor had mentioned. The territorial official who'd gotten rich right after the payroll vanished. The man who'd confessed on his deathbed to murder and robbery. Amos's hands started to shake. This wasn't about archaeology. This wasn't about history. This was about something that powerful people, descendants of powerful people, still wanted to keep buried. And somehow, impossibly, his broken-down rescue horse knew it. That night, Amos didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, Eleanor's research spread before him, reading by the light of a single lamp. The more he read, the darker the story became. Captain Marcus Thornfield had been a decorated officer survivor of the Civil War, known for his integrity and his refusal to participate in the corruption that was rampant in frontier military contracts. He'd complained officially about irregularities in supply deliveries, about civilian contractors being paid for goods never delivered, about land office officials who seemed to know troop movements before they happened. 2 months before he vanished, he'd written a letter to his commanding officer requesting a full investigation into what he called systematic theft of government resources and conspiracy to defraud the territorial authority. 3 weeks later, he was assigned to escort the largest payroll shipment of the year through isolated country with a minimal guard. It wasn't bad luck. It was a setup. Amos looked up from the papers to find Dusty standing outside the kitchen window, illuminated by moonlight, staring directly at him through the glass. The horse's eyes caught the lamplight, reflecting it back in a way that seemed almost luminous. And in that moment, Amos understood with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely. Dusty wasn't just a horse with cavalry bloodlines. He wasn't just an animal with good instincts or genetic memory. He was a witness, Somehow, across a century and a half, this creature remembered. Remembered the trail, the ambush, the place where good men had died and been buried in unmarked graves. Remembered the gold hidden away and the conspiracy that had stolen justice, along with money. And he'd been waiting all this time for someone to care enough to listen. "All right," Amos said quietly to the horse, watching through his window. "All right, you want to show me something tomorrow. We'll go looking. But you're going to have to lead the way, old man, because I sure as hell don't know where to start." Dusty tossed his head once, a gesture that looked almost like a nod, then turned and walked back toward the barn, his gait steady and sure in the moonlight, nothing like the broken shuffle he showed in daylight. Amos watched him go, then looked down at the research papers one more time. At the bottom of one page, Eleanor had written a note in red pen. "Be careful, the Cortez family still has money and influence. If they think you're getting close to something, they'll do whatever it takes to protect their legacy." His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Rock, this is Dr. Chen. I forgot to mention. I'll have colleagues joining me tomorrow to begin preliminary surveys of the valley. We'll try not to disturb you, but you may see some activity on adjacent properties. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Except there were no adjacent properties. Everything for 2 miles around was either national forest or Amos's land. She was coming back, and she wasn't coming alone. Amos looked out the window at his barn, at the dark shape of the mountains beyond, at 200 acres of land that suddenly felt like a battlefield. Tomorrow he'd find out what Dusty knew. Tonight he'd prepare for war. He pulled his grandfather's old Winchester from the closet, checked that it still fired, and set it by the door. Then he sat down to wait for dawn, while outside a horse that shouldn't exist kept watch over secrets that men had killed to bury and would kill again to keep. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past, and it was digging itself up one hoofprint at a time. Dawn came cold and pale, the sun struggling to burn through a layer of high clouds that turned the valley into something ghostly and uncertain. Amos had dozed in his chair, maybe an hour, the Winchester across his lap, when Dusty's insistent whinnying pulled him fully awake. He stumbled to the window. The horse stood in the yard, saddled. Amos blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The saddle was still there, his old working saddle that had been hanging in the tack room, covered in dust. Somehow it was now cinched tight around Dusty's middle. The stirrups adjusted the bridle in place. "That's impossible," Amos muttered, grabbing his jacket and heading outside. The morning air bit through his shirt as he approached the horse. Dusty stood perfectly still, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. The saddle fit properly, the girth snug but not tight. Everything positioned exactly as Amos would have done it himself. "Did you—" He stopped, feeling foolish. "No, that's crazy. Horses don't saddle themselves." But the tack room door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And there in the dirt, a trail of scuff marks led from the tack room to where Dusty now stood, as if something heavy had been dragged. Amos walked to the tack room, his heart hammering. The saddle rack was empty, the bridle hook was empty, and in the dust on the floor, clear as day, were the rounded imprints of hooves. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. A sound made him turn, the crunch of tires on gravel. A dark SUV was pulling up the ranch road, moving slowly, deliberately. Not Dr. Chen's rental. Something bigger, more official. The kind of vehicle that said government or corporate, the kind that meant serious people with serious intentions. Dusty's ears pinned back flat against his skull. He pawed the ground once hard, then moved to stand between Amos and the approaching vehicle, his body tense and ready. The SUV stopped 50 feet away. 2 men climbed out, both wearing dark suits that looked wrong in the morning light of a Colorado ranch. The driver was tall and angular, his face expressionless behind sunglasses. The passenger was shorter, stockier, with the kind of build that spoke of violence kept professionally controlled. "Mr. Rock," the tall one called, "we're with the Bureau of Land Management. We need to talk to you about your property." Amos didn't move. BLM doesn't wear suits and they call ahead. The man smiled, but it was a bureaucratic expression empty of warmth. Special Investigation Unit. We're looking into some irregularities with historical land grants in this valley. Shouldn't take long. You got identification. The shorter man reached into his jacket. Dusty's whole body went rigid, a sound building in his chest that was more growl than whinny. The man froze, his hand still inside his jacket, staring at the horse. Your animal seems aggressive, he said carefully. He doesn't like liars, Amos replied. Funny thing about horses, they can smell fear and dishonesty better than any polygraph. The tall man's smile faded. Mr. Rock, we can do this easy or hard. We have authority to conduct surveys on any land with disputed historical claims. That includes yours. Show me a warrant. We don't need a warrant for preliminary assessment. Then you don't need to be on my land. Amos took a step forward, his hand dropping to his side where the weight of his grandfather's Colt revolver hung heavy in his jacket pocket. He'd grabbed it on the way out, more from instinct than planning. Leave, now. The two men exchanged glances. Something passed between them, some calculation of risk versus reward. Finally, the tall one nodded. We'll be back, Mr. Rock, with proper documentation, but I'd advise you not to disturb anything on this property in the meantime. If there are historical artifacts present, removing them is a federal crime. Get off my land. They climbed back into the SUV, but before they pulled away, the shorter man rolled down his window. Nice horse. Be a shame if something happened to him. Old animals are fragile. Anything could go wrong. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Then they were gone, dust billowing behind their vehicle as they headed back toward town. Amos stood there, shaking, adrenaline flooding his system, while Dusty pressed his nose against his shoulder in what felt absurdly like reassurance. We need to move, Amos said quietly. Whatever you want to show me, we need to do it now before they come back with actual federal agents, or worse. Dusty pulled away, turning toward the mountains to the east. Without hesitation, without the painful shuffle that usually marked his movement, the horse began to walk. Not toward the road, not toward any trail, Amos knew, straight toward the roughest, most inaccessible part of the high country where the valley walls rose sharp and the forest grew thick. Amos ran back to the house, grabbed his rifle, a canteen, and the documents from Eleanor. He scribbled a quick note. Gone to high country. If I don't come back, give everything to Eleanor Whitman, and left it on the kitchen table, weighted down with his truck keys. By the time he got back outside, Dusty was already 50 yards away, moving with a steady, purposeful gait that seemed impossible for an animal that had looked half dead just days ago. Amos swung into the saddle, and Dusty immediately broke into a smooth trot that ate up the ground, heading into the wilderness like he'd traveled this path 1,000 times before. Maybe he had. They climbed for 2 hours, following game trails that barely existed, crossing streams that had no names, working their way into country that Amos had never fully explored, despite living in its shadow his whole life. The higher they went, the more confident Dusty became, his movements sure and steady, his breathing even despite the altitude and exertion. Amos kept looking back, expecting to see pursuit, but the valley below remained empty, the ranch a tiny collection of buildings growing smaller with each switchback. Around them, ponderosa pines gave way to aspen and Douglas fir, the air growing thinner and colder, the morning sun struggling to reach them through the canopy. Finally, Dusty stopped at a narrow defile between two rock faces, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. He turned his head to look back at Amos waiting. "In there?" Amos asked. The horse nodded, actually nodded, a deliberate up-and-down motion that couldn't be mistaken for anything else, and stepped into the gap. The passage twisted and turned, the rock walls closing in until Amos's knees scraped against ting and stone. Just when he thought they'd have to turn back, the passage opened into a hidden canyon, a slash in the mountain that couldn't be seen from any angle except from directly above. and there scattered across the canyon floor were the unmistakable signs of human presence. Amos dismounted on shaking legs. The canyon was maybe 200 yards long and 30 wide, its walls so steep that trees grew at impossible angles, clinging to rock with desperate roots. A small stream trickled through the center feeding pools that reflected the strip of sky overhead. But it was what lay beside the stream that made Amos's breath catch. Stone cairns, a dozen of them arranged in careful rows, each marking what could only be a grave, and beyond them the scattered remains of a camp, rusted mess tins, fragments of leather tack, the corroded remnants of what might have been weapons or tools. "My God," Amos whispered. Dusty walked forward, picking his way between the cairns with reverent care until he stood before one particular marker larger than the others. The horse lowered his head, and for a moment Amos could have sworn he saw grief in those ancient eyes. Amos approached slowly, as if walking into a church. The large cairn had something wedged between its stones, a piece of metal green with age. He worked it free carefully, a nameplate, tarnished silver engraved with words he could barely make out. He spat on it, rubbed it against his sleeve, and read, "Captain Marcus Thornfield, 7th Cavalry, 1842-1876. He died for truth." The words hit Amos like a physical blow. He sank to his knees beside the grave, the nameplate trembling in his hands. This was real. All of it was real. 23 men had died in this canyon, murdered for gold, and buried in secret, their names erased from history. And Dusty had brought him here to bear witness. Amos looked around the canyon with new eyes, seeing it now as the scene of a massacre. The narrowness of the entrance perfect for an ambush. The high walls, no escape. The graves arranged with military precision despite being dug by desperate dying men. He stood slowly walking among the cairns, reading what little remained of other markers. Sergeant William Hayes, Private John Redding. Names that had vanished from the official record, men whose families had never known what happened to them, who'd been written off as casualties of a savage frontier. Dusty moved to the far end of the canyon where the rock wall rose, sheer and impassable. He pawed at the ground, that same deliberate pattern Amos had seen before, 3 scrapes forward, 2 to the side. Amos joined him, looking at the rock face. At first, he saw nothing but stone and shadow. Then the angle of light shifted, and he noticed something, a vertical crack in the rock, almost invisible, running from ground level to about 8 feet high. He pressed his hand against the crack. The rock moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. But enough to tell him this wasn't solid stone. It was a door, a slab of rock balanced or hinged somehow, designed to look like part of the natural wall. "How do I?" he started to ask. Dusty moved to a boulder near the base of the wall, lowering his head and pushing against it with his shoulder. The boulder rocked slightly. Amos joined him, putting his weight against the stone, heaving with everything he had. The boulder rolled away, revealing a hole beneath it, and in that hole a wooden lever, ancient and rotted, but still intact. Amos grasped the lever and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed through the canyon, the rock slab began to swing inward, revealing a darkness beyond that smelled of earth and time and secrets kept too long. Amos pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to peer inside. The beam revealed a natural cave, maybe 15 feet deep, widening into a chamber. And there, stacked against the far wall, were wooden crates stenciled with faded lettering, U.S. Army Payroll, Denver Mint, 1876. His hands went numb. His vision swam. This was it, the lost payroll. $40,000 in 1876, gold worth millions today, hidden in a cave that dead men had prepared, their last act of defiance against the corruption that killed them. Amos stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on stone. The crates were partially rotted, their contents visible through gaps in the wood. The dull gleam of gold coins still preserved after all these years. but it was what lay on top of the nearest crate that made him stop breathing. A leather satchel remarkably preserved by the dry cave air. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in careful script on paper that crumbled at the edges. The top one was dated August 15, 1876. The day after Thornfield's detail left Denver. Amos read by the light of his phone, "To whoever finds this, we are 23 men of the 7th Cavalry, betrayed by our own government. The men who hired us to transport this payroll are the same men who arranged our deaths. Samuel Cortez of the Territorial Land Office, James Blackwell of the Denver Mercantile Company, Charles Hennigan appointed territorial judge. They sent us into these mountains knowing we would be ambushed. They hired the killers, not Indians, but white men dressed as warriors to hide their crime. We know this because one of the attackers dying from wounds my sergeant inflicted confessed before he passed. He told us everything, how the conspiracy reached to the highest levels, how the gold was never meant to reach Fort Robinson, how our deaths were purchased for a share of the payroll. We are dying now. The ambush was successful. Most of my men are dead or wounded beyond help. We have perhaps a day, perhaps less. But we will use that time to hide this gold where the conspirators cannot find it, and to write this testimony. Our graves will be unmarked, our deaths unreported, but this evidence will remain. To whoever reads this, deliver it to the military authorities. Let the truth be known. Let justice be served, even if it comes too late for us. Captain Marcus Thornfield, 7th Cavalry, United States Army." The letter trembled in Amos's hands. Below it were more documents, testimonies from dying men, a map showing where the ambush occurred, names of the hired killers, details of the conspiracy that reached into the territorial government and beyond. It was all here, the complete record of a crime that had been buried for 150 years. A sound outside the cave made Amos's head snap up. Voices, multiple voices echoing through the canyon. He stuffed the letters back into the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. When he emerged from the cave, Dusty was standing rigid near the canyon entrance, ears flat, facing toward the sound. 3 figures were working their way through the narrow defile, Dr. Chen and the 2 men in suits from that morning. They hadn't seen Amos yet, but it was only a matter of seconds. Amos looked around desperately. The canyon walls were too steep to climb. The entrance was the only way out, and they were blocking it. He was trapped. Then Dusty moved. The horse walked quickly to the stream, turned, and looked back at Amos with unmistakable intent. "Follow me." Amos ran to him, not understanding but trusting. Dusty stepped into the largest of the pools, and instead of stopping in shallow water, he kept going. The water rose to his chest, then his neck, and then he was swimming, his powerful legs driving him forward, swimming toward what looked like solid rock at the pool's far edge. "Stop!" Dr. Chen's voice rang through the canyon. "Mr. Rock, there's nowhere to go." Amos didn't hesitate. He urged Dusty forward, and as they reached what should have been the canyon wall, he saw it a gap hidden by the angle of rock and water just wide enough for a swimming horse. An underwater exit. Dusty dove. Amos had 1 second to gulp air before cold mountain water closed over his head. He clung to the saddle eyes, squeezed shut lungs already screaming, as Dusty pulled them through the submerged passage. 5 seconds. 10. 15. His chest felt like it would explode. Then air. Blessed, beautiful air. They surfaced in another pool, this one outside the canyon, hidden in thick forest on the mountain's far side. Dusty scrambled up the muddy bank, water streaming from his body, and Amos collapsed against his neck, gasping and shaking. Behind them, muffled by rock and water, he could hear shouting. Dr. Chen and her companions had found the cave, found the gold, but they hadn't found the letters. Those were safe, pressed against Amos's chest in the waterproof satchel, the testimony of dead men who'd ensured the truth would survive. Dusty shook himself like a dog, then started walking again, this time downhill. following some path only he could see. And as they moved through the forest, Amos realized something that made his blood run cold. The horse knew about the underwater passage, knew exactly where it was, how long it was, where it led. No animal could learn that in a single lifetime, not without drowning in the attempt, which meant Dusty had been here before, had escaped this way before. 150 years ago, when the massacre happened, at least one horse must have survived. Must have fled through that same underwater passage, carrying the memory of this place, this horror, this injustice. And somehow, impossibly, that memory had passed down through generations until it reached this animal, this guardian who'd waited all this time for someone to care enough to listen. How? Amos whispered against Dusty's neck. How is any of this possible? The horse didn't answer. He just kept walking steady and sure, carrying his rider and the evidence that would finally bring truth to light, heading down the mountain toward whatever came next. Behind them, the canyon held its dead and its gold, but the secrets those were riding out of the wilderness in a leather satchel, borne by a man who'd bought a dying horse out of pity and found himself holding history in his hands. The sun broke through the clouds as they descended, painting the valley below in shades of amber and promise. And for the first time in days, Amos Rock allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice was still possible. Even if it came a century late, even if it rode on the back of a horse that shouldn't exist. They were halfway down the mountain when Dusty suddenly veered off the game trail, plunging into thick undergrowth that seemed impenetrable. Amos ducked low against the horse's neck branches, whipping past his face, trusting a guidance he couldn't understand but no longer questioned. The forest opened into a small clearing, and there impossibly stood a cabin. Not a ruin, not a historical remnant slowly being reclaimed by nature. An actual cabin, smoke rising from its chimney, a garden plot visible on the south side, chickens scratching in a wire enclosure. It looked like it had been lifted from 1880 and dropped whole into 225, preserved in amber, while the world moved on without it. Dusty walked straight to the porch and stopped whinnying once, a sound that held something almost like greeting, like recognition. The cabin door opened and a man stepped out. He was old, maybe 80, maybe older, with a weathered face that spoke of decades in mountain sun and a frame still strong despite the years. He wore clothes that belonged to another century, canvas pants held up with suspenders, a homespun shirt, boots that had been resoled so many times the original leather was just a memory. But it was his eyes that stopped Amos, cold, pale blue, sharp as winter ice, and fixed on Dusty with an expression that mixed joy and sorrow in equal measure. "I'll be damned," the old man whispered. "You found him. After all this time, you actually found him." Amos dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Who are you?" The old man's gaze shifted to Amos, assessing him with the kind of thoroughness that military men never quite lose. "Name's Daniel. Daniel Thornfield." He paused, letting that sink in. "Marcus Thornfield was my father." The world tilted. Amos grabbed the saddle to steady himself. "That's impossible. The massacre was in 1876. Nobody. I'm 97 years old, Mr. Rock, born March 1928. Do the math." Daniel stepped off the porch, moving toward Dusty with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred. "My father died 2 months before I was conceived. My mother was carrying me when she got word he'd vanished. She never remarried, never stopped believing he was murdered, not lost. And when I was old enough to understand, she told me everything." He reached out, placing his hand on Dusty's neck, and the horse leaned into the touch, like a dog greeting its master. "She told me about the horse too, the one her letters said survived, the one that came back to Fort Collins 3 months after the detail vanished half dead, carrying my father's saddle but no rider. They tried to keep it, but it escaped, kept escaping. Every time someone penned it, every time someone claimed it, it found a way out, like it was looking for something or someone." Amos pulled the satchel from his shoulder, holding it out. Your father's letters, the evidence, it's all here." Daniel's hands trembled as he took the satchel, opening it with the care of someone handling holy relics. He pulled out the top letter, and Amos watched tears cut tracks through the dirt on the old man's face. "I've been waiting for this my whole life," Daniel said quietly. "Living out here hidden because my mother warned me. She said the men who killed my father were powerful, that their sons would be powerful, that the conspiracy went deep and wouldn't die easy. She made me promise to stay hidden until the truth came out, until it was safe." He looked up at Amos. "How did you find the canyon?" "I didn't. Dusty did." Daniel smiled, sad and knowing. Of course he did. He always knew. Every generation there's been one horse that remembers. They said it was impossible, just stories, old cavalry legends about ghost horses and blood memory. But I've seen it, watched them come and go, each one carrying something forward, some piece of the past they shouldn't remember but do. He gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. There's more you need to know, and we don't have much time. If you found the canyon, they'll find it too, and when they do, they'll come looking for you." The cabin interior was a museum of hidden history. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, documents yellowed with age. A family tree drawn in careful script dominated one wall, showing the Cortez lineage from 1876 to present day. Next to it, newspaper clippings chronicled the family's rise. Politicians, businessmen, judges, each generation building on wealth that had started with stolen gold. "I've tracked them for 70 years, Daniel said, pouring coffee that smelled like it had been brewed over an actual fire. "Every descendant, every business venture, every piece of political influence. The Cortez Foundation isn't about historical preservation, Mr. Rock. It's about historical burial. They find sites like the canyon, claim them for archaeology, then make sure nothing damaging ever comes to light." Amos sank into a chair that might have been original to the cabin. "Dr. Chen works for them. Dr. Chen is them. Sarah Chen Cortez, great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Cortez. She married into the name, kept her maiden name for professional purposes, but make no mistake, she's family, and she's the current guardian of their secret." Daniel set down a photograph recent showing Dr. Chen at some academic function. "She's been tracking rumors of the canyon for 5 years. Your horse showing up, digging up that button that must have set off every alarm they had." "How did you know about the button?" "Because I've been watching your ranch. Watching you." Daniel's expression turned apologetic. "When Dusty appeared at that auction when you bought him, I knew the time had finally come. That horse has been cycling through owners for decades, always ending up neglected, always ending up at auction, always waiting for the right person. Why me? Because you're the last honest rancher in the valley. Because your family never took bribes from the Cortez land grabs. Because you're stubborn enough and broke enough and lonely enough to do something completely irrational, like spend your last $50 on a dying horse." Daniel smiled. "And because Dusty chose you, don't ask me how he knows. He just does." Amos looked out the window to where Dusty grazed peacefully, as if the morning's escape and underwater swim had been nothing more than a casual ride. "What now? We have the evidence. We go to the authorities." "Which authorities? The Cortez family has federal judges in their pocket, state senators. The current director of the Colorado Historical Society is a second cousin. Even if we could get someone to listen, the legal battles would take years, and we'd be dead long before any verdict came down." Daniel pulled out a drawer, revealing a laptop incongruous in the primitive cabin. "There's only one way this works. We go public, full public. Media, internet, everything at once. Make it too big to bury, too widespread to suppress." He opened the laptop, showing Amos a prepared website, a YouTube channel, social media accounts, all dormant, all waiting. "I've been ready for this for 20 years, since the internet made it possible to bypass traditional gatekeepers. We upload everything, the letters, the photographs of the graves, the genealogical evidence connecting the Cortez family to the original crime. We make it go viral before they know it's happening. They'll come after us. They're already coming after you, Mr. Rock. Question is, do you want to die defending a secret, or do you want to die making sure that secret destroys them? Before Amos could answer, Dusty's warning whinny split the air. Both men rushed to the window. 3 vehicles were working their way up the fire road that Amos hadn't even known existed, the dark SUV from the morning, another identical one, and a white panel van. They were moving fast, too fast for the terrain, desperate. They must have found the cave exit, Daniel said, already moving. Tracked you here. Damn it, I should have known they'd have the resources. How long do we have? 10 minutes, maybe 15. Daniel grabbed the laptop, shoving it into a weatherproof bag along with hard drives and backup documents. There's a tunnel under the cabin. Built it myself over 30 years. Leads to a box canyon 2 miles north. My truck's there old, but it runs. We can make it to town to Eleanor Whitman's place. She has satellite internet security cameras. We can upload from there. What about Dusty? Daniel paused, his face stricken. The tunnel's too small for a horse. He'll have to... He stopped, unable to say it. Amos looked out at the horse, at the creature that had carried him into mystery and through miracle, that had remembered when everything else forgot. I'm not leaving him. Then you're dying here. They won't hesitate to kill you, Mr. Rock. The evidence you carry is worth multiple lifetimes in prison for some very powerful people. They'll burn this mountain to ash before they let it see daylight. The sound of engines grew louder. 5 minutes, maybe less. Amos made a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. Give me the evidence, all of it. I'll lead them away, buy you time to get to Eleanor's, upload everything, make sure it counts. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe Dusty knows one more impossible thing. Amos grabbed the bag with the laptop and documents. That horse has survived the impossible for 150 years. I'm betting he's not done yet. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My father chose his men well. Seems that quality runs in both our families. He pulled a satellite phone from a drawer, handing it to Amos. Eleanor's number is programmed. When you're clear, if you get clear, call her. Let her know it's happening. They clasped hands, 2 old men from different centuries, united by the same cause, the same desperate hope that truth could still matter, that justice could still be served. Amos ran outside, strapping the bags to Dusty's saddle with shaking hands. The engines were close now, maybe half a mile out. He swung into the saddle, and Dusty immediately wheeled toward the opposite direction, toward what looked like impassable forest. Wait, Daniel called from the porch. He held something up, a worn cavalry hat, the kind officers wore in the 1870s. This was his, my father's. You should have it, for luck. Amos caught the hat, settling it on his head. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him, say. Then Dusty was moving, and the cabin was falling away behind them, and the sound of the pursuing vehicles was growing louder, closer, more urgent. The chase began in earnest when the first SUV crested the ridge and spotted them. Amos heard the vehicle's engine roar as it accelerated, trying to cut them off before they reached the tree line. But Dusty was already there, plunging into forest so thick it seemed impossible to navigate at any speed above a walk. Impossible for anything but a horse that remembered every trail, every game path, every hidden passage through this wilderness. They flew through the trees, Dusty's hooves, finding purchase on ground that looked too steep, too loose, too broken. Behind them, the SUVs tried to follow, but quickly bogged down their engines, whining as wheels spun in loose earth and scraped against stone. Then the shooting started. The first bullet cracked past Amos's ear, close enough to feel its passage. He ducked low against Dusty's neck, the cavalry hat somehow staying on his head, and the horse responded by accelerating, by finding speed that shouldn't exist in an animal his age. They burst from the tree line onto an open slope, and Amos's heart stopped. Below them was a cliff, a sheer drop of at least 200 feet, the kind of fall that meant certain death. Behind them, men were emerging from the SUVs on foot rifles raised. "No way down," Amos gasped. "Dusty, we have to—" But the horse was already moving, angling along the cliff edge, following some path only he could see. And then Amos saw it, a narrow ledge, maybe 2 feet wide, cutting across the cliff face at a steep diagonal. A trail that hadn't been maintained since the cavalry rode these mountains, that probably hadn't been used in a century. Dusty didn't hesitate. He stepped onto the ledge as calmly as if it were a barn aisle and began to descend. The world fell away to Amos's right, nothing but air and death and the valley floor far below. To his left, the cliff face rose sheer and impassable. The ledge crumbled slightly under Dusty's weight, sending small stones pattering down into the abyss. Another shot rang out, hitting the rock face inches from Dusty's head. The horse's ears flickered, but he didn't break stride, didn't panic, just kept moving with the careful precision of an animal that had done this before, that knew every inch of this impossible path. Amos heard shouting above. The pursuers had reached the cliff edge and were staring down at the ledge trail, at the impossibility of what they were witnessing. One of them, braver or more desperate than the others, started to follow on foot. 20 seconds later, his screams echoed through the canyon as he fell, the ledge crumbling beneath his weight. After that, the shooting stopped. Dusty reached the bottom of the cliff, emerging onto a boulder field that looked like the aftermath of some ancient avalanche. He picked his way through the rocks with the same impossible grace, never stumbling, never hesitating, following some map written in memory and blood. They were halfway across the boulder field when Amos heard it, the sound of helicopter rotors, distant but growing closer. He looked up and saw it coming over the ridge, a sleek corporate helicopter with no markings, the kind that money could rent with no questions asked. "They're not giving up," he said to Dusty. "Even after all this, they're not giving up." The horse's ears swiveled back, listening, then forward again. He broke into a gallop, hooves ringing onto stone, heading toward what looked like a solid wall of rock at the far end of the boulder field. The helicopter was closing fast, dropping low, someone leaning out with what looked like a rifle. Amos bent low over Dusty's neck, making himself as small a target as possible, the wind of their passage bringing tears to his eyes. 50 yards from the rock wall, 40, 30. The helicopter was directly overhead now, the downdraft from its rotors making Dusty's mane whip wildly. Amos heard someone shouting through a megaphone, "Stop! There's nowhere to go!" But Dusty just ran harder, faster, everything he had focused on that impossible wall of stone ahead. 20 yards. 10. "Dusty, we can't—" Amos started, and then they were through, not through the wall, around it. A gap invisible from any angle except head-on, just wide enough for a running horse. They shot into a narrow canyon, and Amos heard the helicopter pilot curse over the megaphone as he pulled up hard, unable to follow into the confined space. The canyon twisted and turned barely wide enough in places for Dusty's shoulders, and then suddenly opened into a hidden valley, a perfect bowl surrounded by sheer cliffs, completely invisible from the air or any approach except the one they'd just taken. And there, in the center of the valley, was another cabin, smaller than Daniel's, more primitive but clearly inhabited. A thin line of smoke rose from its chimney, and a weathered sign above the door read, "Thornfield Station Est, 1876. Dusty walked to the cabin and stopped, sides heaving, sweat darkening his coat. But his eyes were bright, alert, triumphant. The cabin door opened, and an old woman stepped out. She was ancient, possibly older than Daniel, her face a map of wrinkles, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were sharp, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "'Bout damn time," she said. "Been waiting for you for 93 years. Amos slid from the saddle, his legs nearly giving out. "Who?" "Name's Catherine Thornfield. Marcus was my grandfather." She looked at Dusty, and something softened in her expression. "And I see you brought the Guardian. Good, we're going to need him." She gestured toward the cabin. "They'll find this place eventually. That helicopter will bring more, but this is where we make our stand, Mr. Rock. This valley, this cabin, this is where the last piece of the puzzle waits. The piece that will bring the whole rotten empire down." Amos heard the helicopter circling outside the valley, searching for a way in. "What piece I have, the letters, the evidence. You have part of it, but there's more. Something my grandfather hid separately, something even Daniel doesn't know about." Catherine's smile was grim. The name's Mr. Rock, not just the men who planned the ambush, but everyone who profited. Every politician who got paid off, every judge who looked the other way, every lawman who covered it up. A complete accounting of the corruption that went all the way to Washington. My grandfather knew if it all came out together, it would implicate too many powerful people, create too many enemies. So he split it, hid the names separately. "Where?" She pointed to the ground beneath the cabin. "Down there. In a cache he prepared before the final ride in case he didn't come back. My grandmother told my father told me. I've been guarding it my whole life, waiting for the day when someone would have the courage to use it." The helicopter sound was growing louder, more aggressive. Through the canyon walls, Amos could hear engines. They were bringing in ATVs, smaller vehicles that could navigate the terrain. "How long until they find the entrance?" he asked. "An hour, maybe less if they get lucky." Catherine pulled a lockbox from inside the cabin, setting it on the porch. "But we don't need long, just long enough to dig up what's buried and add it to what you carry. Then you ride out of here, Mr. Rock. There's one more exit from this valley, one more escape route that only the Thornfield family knows. You take that route, you make it to Eleanor Whitman, and you burn these bastards to the ground." "What about you?" Her smile turned fierce. "I'm 93 years old. Been hiding my whole life. I'm done hiding. When they come through that canyon, they'll find me right here, ready to tell them exactly what I think of their family legacy. They'll kill you. Probably, but I'll make sure they regret it first." She pressed a shovel into his hands. "Now dig. Southwest corner of the cabin, 3 feet down. There's an iron box. That's what you're after." Amos dug his muscles, screaming, while Dusty stood guard, and Catherine kept watch on the canyon entrance. The dirt was hard-packed, resistant, but he worked with desperate strength, knowing every second counted. 2 feet down, 2.5. The sound of ATVs echoed through the canyon, closer now. 3 feet. His shovel struck metal. He pulled out the box, smaller than he expected, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived nearly 150 years underground. Inside, carefully preserved, were documents that made his hands shake. Names, dozens of them. Senators, judges, army generals. The complete web of corruption that had protected the conspiracy. And attached to each name, amounts. How much they'd been paid, where the money went. A complete accounting of how the stolen gold had bought silence at every level of government. "My God," Amos whispered. "Told you it was worth dying for," Catherine said. "Now pack it up and get ready to ride." The first ATV appeared at the canyon entrance, then another, then 3 more. Men climbed off, weapons drawn, and Amos recognized the shorter man from the SUV, the one who'd threatened Dusty that morning. Catherine stepped off the porch, positioning herself between the cabin and the approaching men, a shotgun cradled in her arms, with the ease of someone who'd been carrying weapons since before these men were born. "That's far enough," she called out. "This is private property, Thornfield property, and you're not welcome." The short man smiled. "Mrs. Thornfield, we don't want trouble. Just hand over whatever Mr. Rock gave you, and we'll leave peacefully. Nothing about your family has ever been peaceful. You're built on murder and lies, same as your ancestors." She raised the shotgun slightly. "But I suppose that's ending today. You're one old woman with 1 gun against 8 men with rifles. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Catherine laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "My grandfather was reasonable. He followed the law, trusted the system, and they murdered him for it. I'm done with reasonable. She glanced back at Amos. The exits behind the cabin, false wall on the east deed outside, push the center plank and it swings open. Trail beyond leads to the fire road 2 miles out. Dusty knows the way. Her eyes found the horse. Don't you, old friend? Dusty tossed his head, pawing the ground once ready. Go, Catherine said to Amos. Right now, and don't look back. Catherine, I said go. The old woman's voice cracked like a whip. Make it mean something, all of it. The waiting, the hiding, the 150 years of carrying this truth. Make it mean something. Amos climbed into the saddle, the iron box secured in the saddlebag alongside the laptop and documents. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to fight, to not leave this fierce old woman to face these killers alone. But she was right. The evidence mattered more than any of them. The truth mattered more than pride or honor or the desire to stand and fight. He turned Dusty toward the cabin, toward the escape route, while behind him, Catherine's voice rang out one more time. My name is Catherine Ann Thornfield, and I am the granddaughter of Captain Marcus Thornfield, United States 7th Cavalry. You murdered him. You stole from him. But you couldn't silence him, and you won't silence me. The first shot rang out as Dusty found the false wall as it swung open to reveal the hidden trail beyond. The last thing Amos heard as they plunged into the passage was Catherine's shotgun answering back, defiant to the end. The hidden trail spit them out onto the fire road just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold that felt obscene against the violence they'd left behind. Amos pulled Dusty to a halt, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins, Catherine's final defiance still echoing in his ears, alongside the crack of gunfire. He pulled out the satellite phone with numb fingers and dialed Eleanor's number. She answered on the first ring. Amos, thank God, Daniel got here 20 minutes ago. He's setting up the upload now, but we need... Catherine's dead, Amos said, his voice flat, hollowed out. Or she will be soon. She bought us time. We can't waste it. A pause heavy with grief and understanding. Come to my house, back way through the old Miller property. They'll be watching the main roads. How long for the upload? With everything 2 hours, maybe 3. Daniel's files are massive documents, photographs, genealogies, audio recordings. He's been preparing this for decades. We don't have 3 hours. They'll be coming. Eleanor's voice turned to steel. Then we make the time. Get here, Amos. Bring what you found. We finish this tonight. The line went dead. Dusty needed no urging. The horse turned south, taking a route that wound through private property and abandoned homesteads, avoiding the main roads, with the same impossible knowledge that had carried them through every danger. They moved through the dying light like ghosts, like the last remnants of a West that had already passed into legend. 40 minutes later, they emerged in Eleanor's backyard. Daniel's truck was parked behind the garage, nearly invisible from the street. The house blazed with light, every window illuminated, and Amos understood if they were coming anyway, better to see them approach. He slid from the saddle legs, nearly buckling, and led Dusty to Eleanor's small barn. The horse had given everything, run beyond what should have been possible, survived what should have killed him. Amos bedded him down with fresh hay and water, his hands gentle on the animal's sweat-darkened neck. Rest now, he whispered. You've done enough, more than enough. Dusty's eyes met his dark and fathomless, carrying depths of understanding that transcended species. Then the horse lowered his head to the hay, and for the first time since this began, he looked his age ancient weary, ready for whatever end awaited. Amos stumbled into Eleanor's house to find controlled chaos. The living room had been transformed into a command center. 3 laptops sat open on the coffee table, cables snaking between them, external hard drives blinking with activity. Daniel sat at the center of it all, his weathered fingers moving with surprising speed across the keyboards, uploading, organizing, preparing to release a century and a half of buried truth. Eleanor stood by the window, a rifle propped against the wall beside her, watching the street. She turned when Amos entered, her expression tight with controlled emotion. "Catherine," she asked quietly. She stood her ground, made them work for it. Amos pulled the iron box from his jacket. "She gave us this, said it was the final piece." Daniel's hands stilled on the keyboard. He stared at the box like it was the Ark of the Covenant. "The names," he breathed. She had the names. All of them. The complete web. Daniel opened the box with trembling fingers, spreading the ancient documents across Eleanor's dining table. His face went pale as he read, then flushed with something between rage and vindication. "This is it," he said. "This connects everything. The original conspirators, the people, they paid off the chain of corruption that protected them. And look," he pointed to a ledger page. "It traces forward. Each payoff created a debt, a connection. Cortez used those connections to build his empire, and his descendants have been cashing in those same debts for 5 generations. Eleanor joined them, reading over Daniel's shoulder. "Senator Blackwell, Judge Hennigan, General Morrison. My God, these names are in history books. Schools are named after some of these men." "Built on blood money," Daniel said. "Every monument, every endowment, every civic achievement funded by gold stolen from dead soldiers." He began photographing the documents with a professional scanner connected to one of the laptops. "This doesn't just bury the Cortez family. This rewrites Colorado history, maybe American history." Amos sank into a chair, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. "How long?" "The original files are uploading now, 40% complete. With these new documents, add another 90 minutes. Daniel didn't look up from his work. "But once it starts publishing, it'll be everywhere simultaneously. YouTube, WikiLeaks, every major news outlet, social media platforms. I've got automated accounts that will push it out faster than any suppression effort can stop it." "They'll claim it's fake," Eleanor said. "Deep fakes, forgeries, conspiracy theories. That's why we're releasing everything. The original documents for forensic analysis, the genealogical records anyone can verify, the photographs of the graves with GPS coordinates, the paper trail of the Cortez Foundation's efforts to suppress this information." Daniel's smile was grim. "They can claim whatever they want. The evidence speaks for itself." The sound of vehicles on the street made them all freeze. Eleanor moved to the window, peering through the curtains. 2 SUVs. Parking 4 houses down, trying to be subtle about it. "How many people?" "6 that I can see. Probably more." Daniel checked his laptop. 55%. "We need more time." Amos stood, picking up Eleanor's rifle, checking the load with practiced hands. "Then we buy it. How many guns do you have?" Eleanor opened a cabinet, revealing an arsenal that would have done a militia proud. "My late husband was a collector and a believer in the Second Amendment." They armed themselves in silence, rifles, shotguns, revolvers. Amos felt the weight of the weapons and knew with sick certainty that they might have to use them, that people might die tonight over words and truth and justice that was a century overdue. "There's another way," Daniel said quietly. He pulled a small device from his pocket, a thumb drive. "This has everything, the complete files, compressed. If something happens, if they stop the upload, one of us needs to get this out. To a journalist, to the FBI, to anyone who'll listen." "They're watching the house," Eleanor said. "Nobody's getting out. Dusty could." They all turned to look at Amos. "That horse has gotten through everything they've thrown at us. If we rig some kind of saddlebag, secure the drive, send him out the back." "They'll shoot him," Eleanor said. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll do one more impossible thing." Amos looked at Daniel. "You said there's been one in every generation, one horse that remembers. If Dusty dies tonight, will there be another?" Daniel's expression turned distant, thoughtful. "The bloodline continues. There are descendants scattered across the West, most of them unremarkable animals living ordinary lives. But one of them will hear the call. One of them will remember. It's not about the individual horse, Mr. Rock. It's about the memory they carry, the purpose that passes from one to the next. Then we give him a fighting chance to pass it on. Amos headed towards the back door. Keep uploading. I'll prep Dusty. If this goes bad, I'll send him out with the drive. After that, he checked his rifle one more time. We hold them off as long as we can. Outside, full darkness had fallen, the valley swallowed by night except for scattered house lights and the cold glitter of stars overhead. Amos entered the barn to find Dusty on his feet, alert ears forward. The horse knew. Somehow he always knew. "One more run, old friend," Amos said, securing the thumb drive in a waterproof case and strapping it to a special rig he fashioned from Eleanor's leather work belt. He wrapped it tight around Dusty's neck, hidden under the mane. "If we don't make it, you take this to someone who cares. You find someone like me, I guess. Someone fool enough to listen to a horse." Dusty lowered his head, and Amos pressed his forehead against the white star between the horse's eyes. For a moment they stood like that man and animal sharing something that went beyond words, beyond species, beyond time itself. A shout from the house brought Amos running back inside. "They're moving," Eleanor said from the window. "3 coming to the front, 3 going around back." Daniel's fingers flew across the keyboard. 72%, just need 20 more minutes. "We don't have 20 minutes, Amos said. The first knock came professional, almost polite. Then Dr. Chen's voice amplified by a megaphone. "Mr. Rock, we know you're in there. We know what you have. There's still a chance to resolve this peacefully. Open the door and let's talk." Eleanor called back through the closed door. "You murdered Catherine Thornfield this afternoon. You've been covering up mass murder for 5 generations. There's nothing to talk about." A pause. "Then, Mrs. Whitman, you're harboring stolen property and interfering with a federal investigation. You're making this much worse than it needs to be." "Federal investigation," Daniel muttered. "That's rich. They've probably got some bought judge signing warrants right now." The back door exploded inward, the frame splintering under a battering ram. 2 men rushed in, weapons drawn, but Amos was already there. He fired once deliberately high, the bullet punching through the wall above their heads. The men dove for cover. "Next one, center mass," Amos shouted. "This is still our home. You're still the ones breaking in." From the front room came the sound of breaking glass. They were coming through the windows. Eleanor's shotgun roared and someone screamed. The front door shuddered under repeated impacts. 85%, Daniel called. 10 more minutes. But time had run out. The front door gave way, and men poured in, professional, tactical, moving with military precision. These weren't just corporate security anymore. These were trained killers, people who knew how to end resistance quickly and permanently. Amos fired, dropped one man, then another. Eleanor's rifle cracked from the front room. Daniel had abandoned the laptops, armed, now defending the equipment with everything he had. A bullet shattered one of the laptops, then another. They were targeting the equipment, trying to stop the upload. "Get Dusty out!" Daniel screamed. "Now!" Amos ran for the back door, providing cover fire as he went. He burst into the barn to find Dusty already moving, already understanding. The horse followed him out into Eleanor's backyard, where chaos reigned. 2 men stood between them and freedom. Dusty didn't hesitate. He charged 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury and ancient purpose, scattering the men like bowling pins. One went down hard, the other dove aside, and then they were through, racing across the dark yard toward the tree line beyond. Gunfire chased them, bullets kicking up dirt, whining off rocks. Dusty ran like he'd run in the mountains, like he'd run from the canyon, like he'd run for 150 years, with speed that defied age and wounds and exhaustion, carrying the last hope of truth toward uncertain salvation. They hit the trees, and Amos veered right, leading pursuit away from town, away from potential witnesses. Behind them, more gunfire erupted at Eleanor's house, sustained, intense, desperate. "Go!" Amos shouted to Dusty, pulling the thumb drive free and pressing it into a special compartment he'd built into the saddle. "Find someone, anyone, make them listen." He slapped the horse's flank hard, sending Dusty plunging deeper into the forest. Then Amos turned back, rifle raised, ready to buy every second he could. The first pursuer crashed through the underbrush. Amos fired, missed, fired again. The man went down. Another appeared, then 2 more. Amos retreated, using the trees for cover, his ammunition running low. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, sending the rifle flying. He fell, tasting dirt and blood, fumbling for his revolver with his good hand. Above him, flashlights cut through the darkness. Voices shouted coordinates, closing in. This was it then, the end of the line. But Dusty had gotten away. The evidence would survive, even if he didn't. Amos Rock closed his eyes and waited for the final shot. It never came. Instead, sirens. Multiple sirens growing louder, converging on Eleanor's house from every direction. Confused shouting among his pursuers, then the sound of them retreating, crashing back through the forest toward their vehicles. Amos lay there, bleeding, confused, unable to process what was happening. Then hands were on him, gentle hands, helping hands. A paramedic's face swam into view, young and concerned. "Sir, can you hear me? You're going to be okay. Just stay with me." As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Amos caught fragments of conversation from the police radios. Massive data dump across multiple platforms. News networks confirming authenticity. Cortez Foundation executives being taken into custody. Eleanor appeared, her arm in a sling, but alive, gloriously alive. "It worked," she said, tears streaming down her face. Daniel got the upload finished. While they were busy with us, the whole thing went live. Every news station, every platform. It's everywhere, Amos, everywhere. Daniel, her face fell. He didn't make it. Took 3 bullets protecting the equipment, but he made sure it finished. His last act was hitting publish. Amos closed his eyes, grief and triumph warring in his chest. Dusty, gone, disappeared into the forest. But he did his job. They all did. 3 months later, Amos Rock stood in Eleanor's living room watching the news on her television. The Cortez family empire was collapsing. Indictments, resignations, asset freezers. The governor had ordered a complete investigation into historical land fraud. Universities were renaming buildings, removing plaques, rewriting textbooks. And in a mountain canyon that tourists now flocked to see, 23 graves had been properly marked, each with a military headstone. Captain Marcus Thornfield and his men finally had the honor they'd been denied for a century and a half. The Thornfield Foundation had been established, funded by recovered assets and public donations dedicated to uncovering buried truths and supporting native land restitution. Eleanor served as its director. Daniel's research formed its core mission. Amos's shoulder had healed, though it ached in cold weather. His ranch still struggled, but donations from supporters who'd followed the story had bought him time. Enough time to figure out the future. He stood at his kitchen window, as he did every morning, looking out at the barn, at the empty pasture where Dusty had grazed. The horse had never returned. Search parties had found tracks leading deeper into the mountains toward the high country, where wild horses still ran. Some claimed to have seen him, an old brown gelding, moving through the trees with impossible grace, always just beyond reach. Others said it was just legend, imagination, the human need to believe in magic. Amos didn't care what they believed. He knew the truth. Dusty had done what he came to do, had delivered justice on hooves that remembered when remembering should have been impossible, had carried the weight of history until someone cared enough to listen. And somewhere out there, in some meadow or canyon or hidden valley, his bloodline continued. One of his descendants would hear the call when the time came, would remember what needed remembering, would wait for the next person foolish enough, lonely enough, desperate enough to show compassion to a dying horse, because that's how truth survived. Not in monuments or museums, but in the small acts of mercy that connected one generation to the next in the stubborn insistence that justice mattered, even when a century had passed, in the recognition that the past was never truly dead as long as someone remembered. Amos pulled on his jacket and headed outside toward work that still needed doing, toward a future that felt possible again. At the barn door, he paused, looking up at the mountains where morning light was just touching the peaks. "Thank you," he said quietly to a horse that was gone but never forgotten. "For choosing me, for trusting me, for reminding me that mercy isn't weakness and compassion isn't foolish." The wind carried his words into the high country where wild horses ran and memories lived, in blood and bone, waiting for the next chapter of a story that would never truly end. Because some debts get paid no matter how long it takes. Some truths refuse to stay buried. And some horses carry justice on their backs until the world finally has the courage to listen. Amos Rock had bought a dying horse for $50 and found himself holding history in his hands. He'd lost almost everything in the process, but he'd gained something worth far more than gold or property or pride. He'd gained the knowledge that one person, one choice, one act of irrational kindness could still change the world. And in a valley where ghosts finally rested and truth finally lived in daylight, that knowledge was wealth enough for any lifetime.